1, C-13.
Sénateur Cormier.
Number 1, C-13. Senator Cormier. I propose that the bill be read for the third time. Honourable Senator Cormier, seconded by the Honourable Senator Miville-Deschênes, moves that the bill be read for a third time. On debate, Senator Cormier. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dear colleagues, Canada is established on a territory that has been occupied since time immemorial by Indigenous peoples. Full recognition of this reality and of the impacts of colonization are essential when working towards reconciliation and building the Canada of today and tomorrow. I would like to point out that the lands on which we are gathered and from which I am speaking to you are part of the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am pleased and excited to speak today at third reading of Bill C-13, an act to amend the Official Languages Act, to enact the Use of French in Federally Regulated Private Businesses Act, and to make related amendments to other acts. As sponsor and chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Official Languages, I have two quotes in mind as I address you. First, from Quebec photographer Martin Paquette, this artist-adventurer said, "Success is like climbing a mountain. You must work as a team, face obstacles and bad weather. But no matter what, you always reach the top." The second quote is a Tibetan proverb that fits well with Martin Paquette's quote. It is, "When you've reached the top of the mountain, keep climbing." And I would add, it's because the work is never done. Colleagues, the vast task of modernizing the Official Languages Act, begun several years ago, has now reached a climax. There will always be work to be done on language rights and the protection of minorities, but the bill marks a very important step towards full recognition of language rights in Canada. From the outset, I'd highlight the remarkable work accomplished in recent years in this area by parliamentary committees, including the Standing Senate Committee on Official Languages, but also the work done by organizations and individuals in civil society who have devoted so much energy, resources, and effort to get us where we are. We need only think of the hundreds of witnesses heard over the past few years, the numerous briefs submitted, and the reports and recommendations formulated. The modernization proposals studied and received in the Senate since 2017 have been highly varied and rigorously debated. Bill C-13, an act for substantive equality of Canada's official languages, is a challenge for Canadian society as a whole, because the process of modernizing the OLA is more urgent than ever, given several realities. The last major revision of the Act dates back to 1988, for example. Also, the new demographic, institutional, and technological context demands that this quasi-constitutional law be modernized to adapt to the new realities. Also, the decline of French across the country, the declining demographic weight of Francophones outside Quebec, the need for greater protection of minority language communities, and greater support for bilingualism. Recurring problems of compliance with the Act on the part of federal institutions, to name but a few, are all factors that call for modernizing this Act. It was against this backdrop that the government's February 2021 reform paper, which set out the broad directions for modernizing the OLA, resulted in June 2021 in the tabling of Bill C-32. Bill C-32 died on the order paper and is the source of Bill C-13. Now we are at third reading of C-13, which is a much improved version of C-32, thanks to the hard work of MPs from all parties in the other place, and also thanks to you, colleagues. The preliminary study by the Senate Committee on Official Languages between May and November 2022 contributed to enhancing the bill. The version of C-13 you have in your hands is the fruit of hundreds of amendments, tabled, debated, rejected, and adopted. It is therefore the result of compromise and negotiation, not only between political parties, but also between governments as demonstrated by the agreement reached with the Quebec government.
It carefully reconciles the needs, interests, and aspirations of Canadians, whether they belong to official linguistic majorities or official language minority communities. Nonetheless, concerns remain about C-13, some of which were heard by the Senate Standing Committee on Official Languages during its recent deliberations. As you know, on June 1st, 2023, your committee received an order to examine Bill C-13. Since your committee reported on the subject matter of this bill on November 17, 2022, the House of Commons have made more than 60 amendments. Your committee applauds the work done in the other place to improve Bill C-13 and bring it more in line with stakeholders' expectations. That said, in the 2 meetings devoted to the study of Bill C-13, your committee was privileged to hear from the Minister of Official Languages and the President of the Treasury Board and their staff, the Commissioner of Official Languages, 3 experts, and the 2 main civil organizations representing English-speaking minorities of Quebec and French-speaking communities outside Quebec. Although your committee did not propose amendments, it respectfully submitted 8 important observations that I will discuss later in this speech. But first, let me present some of the bill's key positive measures.
I'll begin with the complete overhaul of Part 7 of the Official Languages Act, which aims to enhance the vitality of the English and French linguistic minority communities in Canada, support and assist their development, and foster the full recognition and use of both English and French in Canadian society. With the adoption of Bill C-13, the obligations of federal institutions will be the subject of several new provisions, including the strengthening of the framework for taking positive measures by federal institutions. Bill C-13 also sets out the obligation to adopt a Francophone immigration policy in order, in particular, to promote the restoration and growth of the demographic weight of Canada's Francophone minorities. Colleagues, this is a significant step forward. C-13 also reinforces the federal government's commitment to providing learning opportunities of equivalent quality in the minority language throughout the education continuum, from early childhood to post-secondary education, supports the creation and dissemination of scientific information in French, fosters public acceptance and appreciation of English and French, and promotes the bilingual character of Canada at home and abroad. Bill C-13 thus proposes fundamental changes to Part 7, including obligations for 2 new ministers, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. The promotion of French in Canada, as well as the vitality of minority communities, will benefit from this important legislative lever. Furthermore, with regard to language clauses, C-13 now obliges federal institutions to take the necessary steps to encourage the inclusion of such clauses in the development of agreements with provincial and territorial governments. This will help advance the equality of English and French in Canadian society and support official language minority communities.
Taking positive measures.
In the same vein, with regard to the vitality of linguistic minority communities, there's another key measure in Bill C-13, that of setting out the federal government's obligation to estimate the number of rights holders under Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Colleagues, for years, stakeholders have deplored the lack of data to fully enumerate those entitled to minority language education. An accurate estimate of rights holders will benefit the planning of education programs by provinces and territories, school boards, and communities. With this new legislative provision, the government will participate in estimating the number of rights holders using the necessary tools, including the population census. While respecting provincial jurisdictions, the federal government will thus be able to collaborate with provinces and territories or school boards to obtain a more accurate picture of the number of entitled persons. The various methods, instruments, and sources of data collection are bound to evolve in the future. One thing is clear, however, this new commitment, enshrined in the Modernized Official Languages Act, will provide the guarantee of practice necessary for the vitality of official language minority communities. It also sends a clear message about the Government of Canada's commitment towards minority language education. I cannot address Part 7 without mentioning its role with regard to Quebec's English-speaking communities. The Official Languages Act contains the federal government's commitment to promote English and French in Canadian society. It also contains a commitment to support the vitality of official language minority communities, that is, Francophone communities outside Quebec, but just as much the English-speaking communities of Quebec.
C-13 will support the country's English-speaking community in Quebec. Bill C-13 contains many measures that will benefit English-speaking Quebec and its protection and development as an official language minority community. We heard many representatives of the English-speaking community express their concerns about their linguistic rights, the effect of Bill C-13 on their communities in Quebec, and the asymmetry. We heard about their fear that the bill drives a wedge between English and French-speaking communities and of the lack of adequate job opportunities. Nevertheless, colleagues, the following examples should attest that the English-speaking community in Quebec would be better off with than without C-13. First, there is a recognition in the preamble included in Section 41 of the Act, which highlight the uniqueness and diversity of the French and English linguistic minority communities and their contributions to Canadian society. These provisions will recognize the specificity and diversity of those communities and sociodemographic reality that was not clearly reflected in the Act of 1988. These changes constitute a recognition of the important and historical contribution of Canada's English and French linguistic minority communities. Le projet de loi C-13 permettra aux
Bill C-13 will provide English-speaking communities in Quebec with resources to support education in the minority language, English, and to support learning French as a second language. As I understand it, these communities will be just as eligible as Francophone communities for official languages support programs. Projects specific to their communities will be supported to address their priorities in a variety of areas essential to their development. Thus, both in the preamble and in Part 7, Bill C-13 recognizes the importance of supporting essential sectors such as culture, education, from early childhood to post-secondary education, and the health, justice, employment, and immigration sectors, and the vitality of Francophone and Anglophone minority communities, and of protecting and promoting the presence of strong institutions serving these communities. The bill also proposes concrete actions to support these key sectors, such as establishing a new Government of Canada commitment to advancing opportunities for English and French-speaking minority communities, to pursue quality, lifelong learning in their own language. Measures that the Minister of Canadian Heritage can take to promote the equal status and use of our two official languages include, for example, providing funding for the administration of an independent program that supports test cases in the area of language rights, and the right to equal treatment before the law guaranteed by the Canadian Constitution.
Among other things, these measures should be taken to enhance the vitality of official language minority communities, including English-speaking communities in Quebec. They must also respect the necessity of considering the specific needs of each of the two official language communities of Canada, taking into account the equal importance of the two communities. These additions leave no doubt as to the equal importance of both official language minority communities. More specifically, the bill strengthens and clarifies federal institutions' obligation with respect to the taking of positive measures, which is a critical obligation to ensure the development and protection of official language minority communities everywhere in Canada, including the English-speaking communities of Quebec. It also provides additional clarifications with respect to what is expected of federal institutions in taking positive measures, that they be based on analysis, which can in turn be based on the results of a dialogue and consultation activities. These new obligations regarding dialogue and consultation activities are now explicitly stated in Bill C-13, which will ensure that federal institutions meet a certain threshold when taking positive measures while considering the needs of official language minority communities. Institutions must also establish evaluation and monitoring mechanism in relation to the positive measures taken. C-13 ensures that federal institutions will continue to provide service in both official languages. Comme nous l'avons entendu.
As we heard from some of the experts during the recent committee study, mention of Quebec's Charter of the French language does not take away any rights from Quebec's English-speaking communities. Bill C-13 simply recognizes the existence of a provincial law. In response to a question in this regard, Janice Neymark stated before your committee that there is no incorporation by reference with this reference. In fact, here's what Department of Justice lawyer Warren Newman said on the subject when he appeared before the Official Languages Committee in the other place, and I quote, "I don't see how federal services offered by federal institutions would be compromised by the simple mention of the fact that the government recognizes the Charter of the French language and other language regimes as part of the overall context," end of quote. As Mr. Newman was involved in drafting the legislative proposals for the first modernization of the Official Languages Act in 1988, his insights on this subject are much appreciated. We also heard in committee that Bill C-13 will not undermine the rights of English-speaking Quebecers. Michel Doucet, lawyer and official languages specialist, confirmed before your committee, and I quote, "Sections 16 to 20 and 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms will continue to apply and recognize the constitutional rights of English-speaking Quebecers. These rights cannot be taken away. Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867 will also remain. Their constitutional linguistic rights remain, despite the reference to Bill 96 in the federal law." End of quote. Mr. Doucet also pointed out.
Senator Omidva.
Senator Cormier is speaking too fast, I believe, for the translation, and we're missing significant portions. So if he could ream back about a paragraph, that would be useful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My enthusiasm may not always be the best tool. So, we also heard at committee that Bill C-13 will not undermine the rights of English-speaking Quebecers. Michel Doucet, lawyer and official languages specialist, confirmed before your committee, and I quote, "Sections 16 to 20 and 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms will continue to apply and recognize the constitutional rights of English-speaking Quebecers. These rights cannot be taken away. Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867 will also remain in place. Their constitutional linguistic rights remain, despite the reference to Bill 96 in the federal law." End of quote. Mr. Doucet also pointed out that Section 133, which provides constitutional guarantees for the use of French and English in parliamentary debates, and the National Assembly in Quebec had already created an asymmetry in terms of language when Canada was created in 1867. Indeed, 16133 recognized the rights of English speakers in Quebec, while French speakers in the other provinces did not have the same rights. The asymmetry in language rights is therefore not unprecedented, according to him. Having said all this, in the observations contained in its third report, your committee has noted that the Minister of Official Languages, the President of Treasury Board, and the Commissioner of Official Languages have promised to closely monitor the effects of Bill C-13. Your committee believes that they should pay particular attention to developments affecting Quebec's English-speaking communities and report regularly on the effects of Bill C-13 across Canada, without waiting for the review of the legislation scheduled for 10 years from now. I'd now like to turn to another important subject that the Senate committee heard about during its deliberations, that being Indigenous languages. We were informed that in the context of the Modernization of the Official Languages Act, the chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council met with Minister Joly to discuss the government's approach to official languages. Also, during consultations on the Modernization of the Official Languages Act in 2019, Indigenous groups participated in the process. And with C-13, your committee also learned that Official Languages Minister Ginette Petitpas-Taylor met with the Indigenous Languages Commissioner and Northern Indigenous leaders.
Colleagues, Indigenous languages are an integral part of the cultures and identities of Canadian society. The revitalization and strengthening of Indigenous languages and the reform of official languages must be conducted at the same time. The Modernized Official Languages Act recognizes that nothing should stand in the way of the maintenance and enhancement of languages other than French or English, nor the reappropriation, revitalization, and strengthening of Indigenous languages. La loi sur les langues officielles.
The Official Languages Act and the new act respecting the use of French in federally regulated private businesses must not undermine the support and promotion of Indigenous languages. In keeping with the Indigenous Languages Act, which, in fact, needs more teeth to protect and improve the situation of Indigenous languages in the country. As we heard at committee, the Official Languages Act and the Indigenous Languages Act are two complementary pieces of legislation that seek to revitalize and ensure the vitality of these languages and communities. Indeed, although each law must be given its own scope of application, Mr. Newman confirmed before the committee that these Canadian identity laws must be read in harmony. We also heard at committee that C-13 is entirely in keeping with the spirit of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that the federal government is making every effort to take into account the issue of Indigenous languages in the federal public service. For example, we heard that the government has launched the development of a new language training framework that is more inclusive than existing training, in order to ensure that training is tailored to all equity-seeking groups, including Indigenous employees. In its third report, the committee made a number of observations about Indigenous languages that could serve as a roadmap for the federal government and Parliament over the next few months and years. Allow me to underline the leadership and rigor of the work carried out by my colleagues, Senators Bernadette Clément and Senator Clément and Michel Audette, whom I thank. Colleagues, here's a relevant excerpt from the report. I quote, "Indigenous languages are recognized in the Indigenous Languages Act and, for the first time, in the proposed amendments to the Official Languages Act. This is a small step towards reconciliation. In the spirit of reconciliation and respect for Indigenous peoples' rights to governance and self-determination, we expect the federal government to live up to its obligations under the Indigenous Languages Act. In an article he published as part of the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act, which is just as relevant today in the context of today's debate, the Commissioner of Official Languages stated, and I quote, "Indigenous languages are an important part of Canada's cultural landscape. In a spirit of reconciliation and in keeping with the fundamental values that unite us, all Canadians can support the country's first and official languages." End of quote. Colleagues, we must all support Indigenous languages and official languages by using the appropriate federal legislative vehicles to achieve the desired progress. The Official Languages Act for our country's two official languages and the Indigenous Languages Act for our first languages. Your committee agrees with this assertion that Indigenous peoples in Canada, with their unique experiences and histories, expect the Government of Canada to fulfill its commitments towards them as elaborated and adopted in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, in the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the calls to justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and in the Indigenous Languages Act. Your committee notes that in the absence of substantial reform of the legal regime governing Indigenous languages, Indigenous peoples have little recourse or means to work towards the reappropriation, revitalization, and strengthening of Indigenous languages. Your committee believes it is important to recognize First Nations, Métis, and Inuit languages as the primary languages of this territory, as set out in the Indigenous Languages Act. Your committee notes that the Indigenous Languages Act requires the minister responsible to conduct an independent review of the provisions and application of the Act within 5 years of its coming into force, and every 5 years thereafter. In the spirit of reconciliation and decolonization, your committee expects the federal government to meet and exceed minimum legal expectations in respecting the rights of governance and self-determination of Canada's Indigenous peoples.
Bill C-13 also clarifies the roles and responsibilities of the Minister of Canadian Heritage, the President of the Treasury Board, and the Treasury Board. It also capitalizes on their respective strengths, which are related to their fields of expertise and action. Bill C-13 strengthens the powers of the Treasury Board, which become mandatory, and adds additional powers, including those related to federal institutions' obligations to take positive measures. These responsibilities and functions are aligned with the role of the Treasury Board as a management board, as the employer of the public service, and as the entity that issues directives to federal institutions and monitors their compliance. Bill C-13 proposes to assign the oversight role and that of informing federal institutions of official languages requirements to the Treasury Board. Canadian Heritage, on the other hand, will remain the department focused on the Canadian public, including official language minority communities, with a long-standing expertise and know-how in the matter. J'aimerais maintenant aborder
I would now like to turn briefly to the new obligations to promote the French language for federally regulated. I'd now like to turn briefly to the new obligations to promote the French language for federally regulated private businesses, as set out in Part 2 of Bill C-13, which enacts the Act respecting the use of French in federally regulated private businesses. Bill C-13 recognizes, among other things, that the private sector has a role to play in promoting and protecting the French language. For this reason, the bill sets out new rights and obligations to ensure that consumers can communicate in French with certain federally regulated private businesses, and language of work rights to enable employees to communicate in French.
I believe that this new regime will provide increased protection for French, both for the benefit of Francophones in certain regions with a strong Francophone presence and for the Francophone population of Quebec. The pre-study done by your committee focused in part on this new statute, respecting the use of French in federally regulated private businesses. It undoubtedly influenced the other place work on this topic.
With the passage of this bill, the work will not be over, of course. The regulation-making process will be launched as soon as the bill receives royal assent. These regulations are essential for the implementation of certain key measures. 3 regulations are planned for, one's on positive measures, another one for federally regulated private businesses, and another one on administrative monetary penalties. In concrete terms, colleagues, the implementation of a modernized law begins with royal assent, but the reform will only take shape in its entirety following the making of regulations and the subsequent implementation of certain measures and new regimes via decrees. Although a review of the Act is scheduled in 10 years' time, there is no need to wait 10 years to make improvements to the Act. It's in this spirit that your committee has set out 8 observations which we hope will be taken into consideration by the government and all parliamentarians over the coming months and years. These observations address the following issues: monitoring the implementation of the Official Languages Act, Quebec's English-speaking communities, enumeration of children of rights holders, the bilingual constitution, the discoverability of French in the digital space, the Translation Bureau, and Indigenous languages. As I've already mentioned some of these observations earlier in my speech, allow me to speak briefly about a few others. The bilingual constitution. Your committee notes that certain constitutional texts laying the foundations of our Canadian Confederation, including the Constitution Act 1867, are still official today in English only. Your committee has noted that on March 29, 2022, the Senate unanimously adopted a motion presented by our colleague Senator Dalphon, whom I thank, asking the government to, and I quote, consider in the context of the review of the Official Languages Act the addition of a requirement that a report be submitted every 12 months detailing the efforts made to ensure compliance with Section 55 of the Constitution Act 1982. End of quote. Your committee proposes that the federal government implement the measures proposed in the Senate motion to support progress towards equality of status of the 2 official languages by ensuring that the Minister of Justice of Canada respects Section 55 of the Constitution Act 1982, which requires that all constitutional instruments set out in the schedule to that act be drafted and enacted in French. Furthermore, your committee recommends that the federal government submit to the Senate and House of Commons, as stipulated in the motion, a report every 12 months detailing the efforts made to ensure compliance with this section. I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank our former colleague, the Honourable Serge Royal, for submitting a brief to the committee to this effect. Second observation concerning the discoverability of French in the digital space. Still inspired by the Honourable Serge Royal's brief, your committee is also of the opinion that the presence and discoverability of any work, creation, or research of any kind in the French language are essential to fully ensure the sustainability of the French fact in this country. And your committee therefore recommends that the federal government continue to take concrete initiatives to ensure the dissemination and discoverability of Canadian content in French. In closing, colleagues, although I have not covered all the proposals in this bill, which contains a considerable number of them, and although I have not discussed all the observations made by your committee, this in no way detracts from their importance for the future of our linguistic regime, whether it be proposals for bilingualism in the judicial system, the public service, or other aspects of the bill. Canadians and Francophones in particularly across the country are eagerly awaiting royal assent of Bill C-13. As the committee heard from stakeholders, any further delay of a modernized Official Languages Act can only mean further setbacks for Canada's francophonie. In response to a question posed by the acting chair, the Honourable Lucie Mention, asking what the repercussions would be on minority communities if Bill C-13 were to be adopted late, the Executive Director of the Fédération des Communautés Francophones et Acadiennes said during his appearance, and I quote, "Immigration levels for Canada are to be determined next November for the next 3 years. We know the department is going through a whole consultation exercise that starts now and probably ends in late summer or early fall for immigration, and targets for the next 3 years for the entire country, including Francophone immigration. So, if we no longer have Bill C-13, which gives this very clear directive that we need remedial targets, then that could have an impact for the next 3 years." End of quote. Colleagues, it has been amply demonstrated that there is political will from all sides of the House to achieve an ambitious reform of the Official Languages Act. This, therefore, is an invaluable opportunity, and it's now in your hands. I'm confident that such a legislative instrument will be able to create the conditions necessary to reverse current linguistic trends. I therefore hope, colleagues, that Bill C-13 will win your support, and as quickly as possible. If it's adopted by this chamber, Canadians will be able to look to the future of official languages in Canada with confidence and certainty. I'd like to end on a personal note, just as the adventurous artist Mario Paquette described the challenges of climbing a mountain, saying that you have to work as a team, face obstacles and bad weather. We, colleagues, can be inspired by this vision. We all come to the Senate with the aspirations and dreams of our communities, but we also carry the wounds of the generations that preceded us and those that our communities face today. Each of us carries the weight of history's impact on our cultures, languages, and communities. And we share a desire to improve the lot of our own. There are troubling and absolutely unacceptable realities in Canada, particularly for Indigenous peoples. We must recognize this and show kindness, respect, and understanding for one another. We must also join hands, stick together, and work together with openness to make our common dreams come true. Colleagues, I've been a member of the ALLO Committee since I arrived in the Senate nearly 7 years ago. I've always been moved by the spirit of collaboration that reigns there. Beyond partisanship, beyond our differences, we always reach consensus that benefits all Canadians. I would like to thank Senator Mention, who chaired the committee, for the duration of the study with rigor and fairness.
I sincerely hope that we will continue to be inspired by this spirit, like a team climbing a mountain, taking care of each other. We will make sure we reach the summit. Gaze up at the heavens and gaze at the earth before us and celebrate together what we have achieved, together for the good of all. Thank you.
Which?